On July 15, 2008, Caylee Anthony called 911 from her home in Orlando, Florida. It was the third call she had made to emergency services that day, and her voice carried a desperation that the operator could hear clearly through the phone line. Cindy told the dispatcher that her granddaughter had been missing for 31 days, and that her daughter's car smelled like there had been a dead body in it. That phone call launched an investigation that would captivate the nation and divide public opinion for years to come. The missing child was 2-year-old Caylee Anthony, a little girl with brown hair and big eyes who loved to sing and dance. Her mother was 22-year-old Caylee Anthony, who had been living with her parents, George and Cindy, in their middle-class Orlando neighborhood. The Anthony family appeared normal from the outside, but the investigation would reveal layers of dysfunction and deception that no one could have anticipated. Before we continue with tonight's story, if you're finding this documentary interesting, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps us bring you more carefully researched content. We'd also love to know where you're listening from, so drop a comment below and let us know. Caylee Anthony was born on March 19, 1986, in Warren, Ohio, before her family relocated to Florida. She was the older of 2 children, born to George and Cindy Anthony. Her brother Lee was born 3 years later. George worked in law enforcement and security, while Cindy was a nurse. They lived in a modest home in a quiet Orlando suburb, the kind of neighborhood where children rode bikes and families knew their neighbors. Caylee's childhood appeared relatively normal, though friends and family would later recall signs of trouble. She struggled in school, not academically, but socially. Caylee seemed to crave attention and validation in ways that set her apart from her peers. She told elaborate stories that weren't true, creating fictional friends and experiences. Her parents often dismissed these as harmless childhood fibs, not recognizing them as part of a larger pattern. As Caylee entered her teenage years, the lying intensified. She would tell her parents she was one place when she was actually somewhere else entirely. She fabricated achievements and accomplishments, claiming to have graduated from high school when she hadn't completed all her requirements. Her parents discovered these lies after the fact, creating ongoing tension in the household. Cindy, in particular, tried to maintain control over Caylee's behavior, leading to frequent arguments. In 2005, when Caylee was 19, she discovered she was pregnant. The identity of the father became a source of mystery and speculation. Caylee told different people different stories about who had gotten her pregnant. Some heard it was a young man she had been dating. Others were told elaborate tales about the father being killed in a car accident or dying in military service. The stories never remained consistent. George and Cindy were initially upset about the pregnancy, but eventually embraced the idea of becoming grandparents. Cindy, especially, seemed to view the baby as a chance for renewal, an opportunity to shape a child's life in ways she felt she had failed to do with Caylee. On August 9, 2005, Caylee Anthony was born at a hospital in Orlando. She was a healthy baby, and from the beginning, she became the center of the Anthony household. Caylee brought joy to the Anthony household, but she also intensified existing tensions. Cindy took on much of the childcare responsibilities, often stepping in when Caylee seemed disinterested or overwhelmed. George worked long hours and remained somewhat peripheral to the daily routines of caring for a baby. Caylee, meanwhile, struggled with motherhood in ways that concerned her parents. She seemed more interested in going out with friends than staying home with her daughter. The division of responsibilities created conflict. Cindy would come home from her nursing shifts to find Caylee needed changing or hadn't been fed properly. She would criticize Caylee's parenting, and Caylee would respond defensively. Their arguments grew louder and more frequent. Lee, Caylee's brother, often tried to stay out of the conflicts, retreating to his room when tensions rose. George attempted to mediate but usually sided with Cindy. Despite these problems at home, Caylee presented a different image to the outside world. She posted frequently on social media, sharing photos of Caylee and presenting herself as a devoted mother. The pictures showed a smiling little girl and a young mother who appeared happy and engaged. Friends who saw these posts had no idea about the arguments happening behind closed doors or the strain that was building within the family. Caylee had minimal employment during this period. She told her parents she worked at Universal Studios in Orlando, a lie she maintained for years. In reality, she had worked there briefly, but had been let go. She continued the deception, leaving the house each day as if going to work, when actually she was spending time with friends or boyfriends. Her parents believed her story, never thinking to verify it independently. Money became a constant source of tension. Caylee had no steady income, but wanted to maintain an active social life. She began stealing from her family, taking money from her mother's purse and her grandmother's checkbook. When confronted about these thefts, Caylee would deny them or make excuses. The lying had become so habitual that she seemed unable to tell the truth, even when caught red-handed. In early 2008, Caylee began dating Anthony Lazzaro, a young man who lived in an apartment near the University of Central Florida. She spent increasing amounts of time at his place, sometimes bringing Caylee with her, but often leaving the child with her parents. Lazzaro later said he had no idea about the extent of dysfunction in Caylee's family, or the lies she was telling everyone around her. By June 2008, the relationship between Caylee and her mother had deteriorated significantly. They fought constantly about Caylee's responsibilities as a mother, about her lying, about her staying out all night. On June 15th, there was a particularly intense argument. Cindy had discovered more stolen checks and confronted Caylee. According to some accounts, Cindy threatened to seek custody of Caylee, telling Caylee she was an unfit mother. The argument was heated and ugly. The next day, June 16, 2008, would be the last time anyone outside the Anthony family saw Caylee alive. George later claimed he saw Caylee leave the house with Caylee that morning, both of them dressed and heading out. Caylee told him they were going to work, and the nanny would be watching Caylee. It was a normal morning, according to George, nothing that raised any concerns. But something happened to Caylee on June 16, 2008. The exact circumstances would become the central mystery of the entire case, debated in courtrooms and living rooms across America. What is certain is that Caylee was never seen again after that day. Caylee, however, continued her life as if nothing had changed. She stayed at Anthony Lazzaro's apartment, went to parties, and posted carefree photos on social media. There was no indication that anything was wrong. Caylee's parents didn't immediately realize Caylee was missing. Caylee had a pattern of staying away from home for days at a time, and she had told them she and Caylee were staying with the nanny, a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. Cindy and George had never met this nanny, but Caylee had spoken about her for months. They had no reason to disbelieve her, or so they told themselves later. Throughout late June and early July, Cindy tried to reach Caylee and see Caylee. Caylee made excuses each time. The nanny had taken Caylee to the beach. They were at theme parks. Caylee was sleeping. Caylee always had a reason why Cindy couldn't speak to her granddaughter or see her. She sent a few text messages, but she avoided phone calls where her mother might hear background noise that contradicted her stories. During this month, Caylee's behavior showed no signs of distress. She partied at nightclubs with friends. She participated in a hot body contest at a local bar. She got a tattoo that read Bella Vita, Italian for beautiful life. She borrowed money from friends and her boyfriend, always claiming she would pay them back soon. She seemed happy and carefree, not like someone whose child was missing. On July 15, 2008, Caylee Anthony finally tracked Caylee down. Caylee's car had been towed from an apartment complex parking lot, and the towing company had sent a notice to George and Cindy's address. George went to retrieve the car, and when he opened the trunk, he was hit with an overwhelming smell. George had worked in law enforcement and knew the odor of decomposition. He later said he immediately thought something terrible had happened. George drove the car home and told Cindy about the smell. They found Caylee at Anthony Lazzaro's apartment and brought her home. Cindy demanded to know where Caylee was. Caylee told her that the nanny had taken Caylee, that she hadn't seen her daughter in 31 days. Cindy was incredulous and furious. 31 days? And Caylee was just now saying something? That evening, Cindy made 3 calls to 911. The first 2 were about Caylee stealing a car and money, but the third call was about Caylee. Cindy told the operator that her granddaughter had been missing for a month and that Caylee wouldn't tell her where the child was, who came on the line and confirmed that her daughter had been taken by a babysitter 31 days earlier. The Orange County Sheriff's Office responded immediately. Deputies arrived at the Anthony home and began questioning Caylee. Her story was that she had dropped Caylee off with the nanny, Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, at an apartment on June 9th. When she returned to pick up Caylee, both the nanny and her daughter were gone. Caylee claimed she had been conducting her own investigation, trying to find them, which was why she hadn't reported Caylee missing. This story made no sense to investigators. Why would Caylee wait 31 days to report her daughter missing? Why had she been partying and getting tattoos if her child had been kidnapped? Detectives asked Caylee to take them to places she had been looking for Caylee. She drove them around Orlando, pointing out locations that meant nothing. She took them to Universal Studios and claimed to have an office there where she had been coordinating her search. When they arrived, she admitted she didn't actually work there and hadn't for years. Investigators checked Caylee's story about the nanny. She claimed Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez lived at the Sawgrass Apartments. They went to the apartment Caylee indicated and found it had been vacant for months. They searched for anyone matching the nanny's description and found a woman with that name, but she had never met Caylee or Caylee. The entire story was fabricated. There was no nanny. There never had been. As detectives dug deeper, more lies unraveled. Caylee's job at Universal Studios was fake. Her nanny was fake. Friends she claimed had been helping her search didn't exist. Everything Caylee said seemed designed to mislead investigators. On July 16, 2008, she was arrested and charged with child neglect, filing false official statements, and obstructing a criminal investigation. Caylee was still missing, and her mother was in jail. The media descended on Orlando. The story had every element that captures public attention: a missing toddler, a mother who had waited a month to report it, lies stacked upon lies. Local news coverage quickly went national. Cable news channels provided wall-to-wall coverage. The public reaction was intense and immediate. People were outraged by Caylee's behavior, by the partying, by the apparent lack of concern for her missing daughter. George and Cindy Anthony held press conferences pleading for Caylee's return. Cindy insisted that Caylee was alive and would be found. She believed, or claimed to believe, that the nanny had actually taken Caylee and that her granddaughter would come home safely. George seemed less certain, but supported his wife publicly. The strain showed on both their faces as they faced cameras and questions. Volunteers organized searches throughout Orlando and surrounding areas. They combed through wooded areas, searched near lakes and ponds, distributed flyers with Caylee's photo. The community response was overwhelming, with hundreds of people dedicating their time to looking for the little girl. But as days turned to weeks without finding any trace of Caylee, hope began to fade. Caylee remained in jail, held without bond due to the severity of the charges and concerns that she might flee. She spoke with her parents through recorded jail phone calls, conversations that would later be played in court and analyzed endlessly by the media. In these calls, Caylee showed more concern about not being able to see her boyfriend than about her missing daughter. When her mother pressed her for information about Caylee became defensive and evasive. Forensic analysts examined Caylee's car, the white Pontiac Sunfire that George had retrieved from the tow yard. The smell that George had noticed was tested using air samples and chemical analysis. Experts would later testify that the odor was consistent with human decomposition. They found a stain in the trunk and traces of chloroform. Hair that was microscopically similar to Caylee's was discovered in the trunk, and it showed signs of post-mortem root banding, meaning it had come from a deceased person. Computer forensics revealed disturbing search history on the Anthony family computer. Someone had searched for chloroform, how to make chloroform, neck breaking, and household weapons. These searches had been conducted in March 2008, months before Caylee disappeared. Investigators believed Caylee had made these searches, though determining who was actually at the computer at the time would become a contested issue. In August 2008, documents were released showing that Caylee had told investigators she worked for Universal Studios as an event planner. She had maintained this lie for years, even providing her parents with a fake employee identification card. The depths of her deception were staggering. She had created an entire false life, complete with co-workers who didn't exist and job responsibilities she never performed. Caylee's friends were interviewed extensively. They described her as fun-loving and social, someone who enjoyed being the center of attention. Several mentioned that she often brought Caylee to social events, but in the weeks before the child's disappearance, she had been coming alone. When asked where Caylee was, Casey said she was with the nanny or her parents. No one thought to question this explanation. Anthony Lazaro, Casey's boyfriend at the time of Caylee's disappearance, told investigators that Casey had stayed at his apartment frequently during June and July. He said she never seemed upset or worried. She never mentioned that Caylee was missing. She acted like a carefree young woman enjoying summer, not a mother whose child had been kidnapped. This testimony would prove damaging to Casey's credibility. On October 14, 2008, a grand jury indicted Casey on charges of first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The state was alleging that Casey had killed her daughter, though Caylee's body still hadn't been found. The decision to charge murder without a body was significant, showing prosecutors' confidence in the evidence they had gathered. George and Cindy continued to insist that Caylee was alive. Cindy went on national television, saying she had received tips that Caylee had been spotted in various locations. She clung to hope, even as evidence mounted, suggesting a far darker outcome. George appeared more conflicted, sometimes seeming to acknowledge that Caylee might be dead, then retreating to support his wife's position that their granddaughter would be found alive. The media coverage intensified with the murder charge. Legal analysts debated the strength of the prosecution's case. Could they prove murder without a body? The circumstantial evidence was substantial, but was it enough to convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt? These questions filled hours of television time as the public remained fixated on every development. On December 11, 2008, a utility worker named Roy Kronk was clearing brush in a wooded area near the Anthony home. He had actually called police about this location twice before in August, saying he had seen something suspicious, but his tips had not been followed up properly. This time, he looked more carefully and discovered a small skull in a canvas bag. He immediately called 911. Investigators responded and soon determined they had found human remains. The location was less than half a mile from the Anthony home, in a wooded area off Suburban Drive that had been partially flooded during the summer months. The remains were those of a small child. Scattered around were a canvas laundry bag, a black trash bag, and duct tape. The medical examiner's office took custody of the remains and began the identification process. Using dental records, they confirmed what everyone had feared. The remains were those of Caylee Anthony. The manner of death was listed as homicide, though the exact cause could not be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition. The remains had been exposed to the elements for approximately 6 months. The discovery of Caylee's body transformed the case from a missing child investigation to a murder prosecution. The location where she was found became significant. It was a place Casey knew well, close to her home, off a road she had driven countless times. Prosecutors believed she had placed Caylee's body there shortly after the child's death, possibly on June 16 or in the days immediately following. The physical evidence found with the remains told a story. Duct tape had been placed over the mouth area of the skull, still adhered even after 6 months in the elements. The prosecution would argue this showed the child had been suffocated or had her airways blocked. The laundry bag found with the remains was identified as belonging to the Anthony household. The heart-shaped sticker residue found on the duct tape matched stickers found in Casey's bedroom. Casey was informed of Caylee's discovery while in jail. Her reaction, or lack thereof, was noted by guards and other inmates. She did not break down crying or show visible distress. Instead, she seemed to retreat inward, becoming quiet and withdrawn. This absence of what many considered a normal maternal response to learning of a child's death would be used to paint her as cold and uncaring. George and Cindy were devastated. Despite months of hoping Caylee would be found alive, the reality of her death shattered them. Cindy required medical attention due to the stress. George became despondent. They held a memorial service for Caylee in February 2009, a private ceremony attended by family and close friends. Notably, Casey did not attend, as she remained in jail awaiting trial. The prosecution's theory of the case began to take shape. They believed Casey had killed Caylee, most likely on June 16, using chloroform to render the child unconscious before suffocating her with duct tape. The motive was Casey's desire for freedom, to live the carefree party lifestyle she wanted without the responsibility of a child. She had placed Caylee's body in the trunk of her car, where it remained for several days before disposing of it in the wooded area where it was eventually found. The defense team, led by Jose Baez, faced an enormous challenge. The evidence against Caylee was substantial, and public opinion had already convicted her. Baez needed to create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors while dealing with a client who had lied repeatedly and whose behavior after her daughter's disappearance seemed inexplicable. He began building a defense strategy that would be unlike anything seen in a major murder trial. Jury selection for the trial began in May 2011 in Pinellas County, Florida, after the defense successfully argued that the intense media coverage in Orange County had made a fair trial impossible there. The process took weeks as attorneys questioned potential jurors about their exposure to the case and their ability to remain impartial. Eventually, 12 jurors and 5 alternates were selected and transported to Orlando for the trial. The trial began on May 24, 2011, with opening statements that laid out 2 completely different narratives. Prosecutor Linda Drain Burdick told jurors that Caylee had murdered Caylee because the child interfered with her lifestyle. She presented Caylee as a selfish young woman who valued partying over parenting and who had made the cold decision to kill her daughter. The evidence would show, Burdick argued, that Caylee had used chloroform and duct tape to murder Caylee, then lied for 31 days while her daughter's body decomposed. Jose Baez's opening statement shocked the courtroom. He claimed that Caylee had not been murdered at all. Instead, she had accidentally drowned in the family's swimming pool on June 16, 2008. George Anthony had found her body, and being former law enforcement, had staged it to look like a kidnapping to protect Caylee. Baez further claimed that Caylee's behavior was the result of childhood sexual abuse by George, which had taught her to hide her pain behind lies and smiles. This defense strategy was risky and controversial. It required painting George Anthony as both a child molester and someone who would cover up his grandchild's death. George vehemently denied these accusations, and there was no evidence to support them beyond Baez's assertions. But the strategy aimed to explain the inexplicable, why Caylee had acted so strangely if Caylee's death was an accident rather than murder. The prosecution called dozens of witnesses over the course of the trial. Friends testified about Caylee's partying and lies. Law enforcement officers described the investigation and Caylee's false statements. Forensic experts presented evidence about the odor in the car, the chloroform, the hair with death banding, and the computer searches. Each piece of evidence built toward the conclusion that Caylee had deliberately killed her daughter. Dr. Arpad Vass, a forensic anthropologist, testified about the smell of death found in Caylee's car. He had analyzed air samples from the trunk and found chemical compounds consistent with human decomposition. His testimony was powerful, but also subject to aggressive cross-examination by the defense, who questioned the reliability of his methods and whether the smell could have come from garbage that had been in the trunk. The computer forensics expert testified about the searches for chloroform and neck breaking. However, the defense raised questions about who had actually conducted these searches and when. They presented evidence suggesting George might have been home during some of the searches, attempting to cast doubt on whether Caylee was definitely the person who had looked up this information. The duct tape found on Caylee's remains became a central piece of evidence. Prosecutors argued its placement over the child's mouth proved this was murder, not an accidental drowning. The defense countered that the tape could have been placed there after death by whoever disposed of the body, not necessarily by Caylee. They suggested Roy Kronk, the utility worker who found the remains, might have moved or tampered with evidence. George Anthony's testimony was one of the most dramatic moments of the trial. He adamantly denied Baez's accusations of sexual abuse and covering up Caylee's death. He described June 16, 2008, saying he had seen Caylee and Caylee leave the house that morning, both alive and well. His testimony was emotional, and at times he broke down crying. The jury watched closely, trying to determine whom to believe. Cindy Anthony testified about the smell in Caylee's car, initially telling investigators it smelled like a dead body. On the stand, however, she seemed to backtrack, suggesting it might have been from rotting pizza or garbage. She also claimed responsibility for some of the suspicious computer searches, saying she had looked up chlorophyll, not chloroform, because her dogs were eating bamboo. This testimony appeared designed to help Caylee, and many observers felt Cindy was lying to protect her daughter. The prosecution's case took about 4 weeks to present. They had assembled what they believed was overwhelming circumstantial evidence of Caylee's guilt. There was no smoking gun, no confession, no witness who saw Caylee kill Caylee, but the totality of the evidence, they argued, pointed to only one conclusion. Caylee had murdered her daughter and tried to cover it up with an elaborate web of lies. The defense case was much shorter, lasting only about a week. Baez called witnesses who challenged the prosecution's forensic evidence. Alternative experts testified that the odor in the car might not have been from human decomposition. They questioned whether the hair found in the trunk actually showed post-mortem banding. They suggested the chloroform evidence was unreliable and overstated. Caylee did not testify in her own defense. This was likely a strategic decision, as her history of lying would have made her an easy target for cross-examination. The Fifth Amendment protected her right not to testify, and the judge instructed the jury they could not hold her silence against her. Still, many observers felt the jury might have wanted to hear Caylee explain her behavior in her own words. In closing arguments, prosecutor Jeff Ashton hammered home the pattern of Caylee's lies and the evidence of Caylee's murder. He argued that the defense's drowning theory made no sense. If Caylee had drowned accidentally, why hide her body? Why make up stories about a nanny? Why party and get tattoos? The only explanation that fit all the facts, Ashton argued, was that Caylee had murdered her daughter. Baez countered that the prosecution had not proven how Caylee died or when she died. They had not established that Caylee was even with Caylee when death occurred. The state's entire case was built on character assassination and Caylee's admittedly unusual behavior, not on solid proof of murder. He reminded jurors that they must find Caylee guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that burden had not been met. The jury received the case on July 4, 2011, and began deliberations. The nation waited to see what they would decide. Most legal experts predicted a conviction, at least on the lesser charges if not first-degree murder. The evidence seemed strong, and Caylee's behavior appeared damning. And this case had presented them with complex questions about forensic science and reasonable doubt. After less than 11 hours of deliberation over 2 days, the jury returned with a verdict on July 5, 2011. The courtroom was packed with media, spectators, and the Anthony family. Caylee stood as the verdicts were read. On the charge of first-degree murder, not guilty. On aggravated child abuse, not guilty. On aggravated manslaughter, not guilty. The jury had acquitted her of all charges related to Caylee's death. She was found guilty only on 4 misdemeanor counts of lying to law enforcement. The reaction to the verdict was immediate and intense. People who had followed the trial were stunned. Outside the courthouse, crowds who had gathered to watch the verdict on screens expressed disbelief and anger. Many held signs supporting Caylee and condemning Caylee. The public sentiment was overwhelmingly that Caylee was guilty, and the not guilty verdict felt like a miscarriage of justice to millions of people. Legal analysts scrambled to explain what had happened. Some pointed to the prosecution's decision to charge first-degree murder, which required proving premeditation. Perhaps the jury felt the evidence supported something less than premeditated killing, but were not given that option in a way that felt appropriate. Others suggested the forensic evidence, while compelling to lay people, had been successfully challenged enough to create reasonable doubt in the jurors' minds. Several jurors spoke to the media in the days and weeks following the verdict. They explained that while they believed Caylee was probably involved in Caylee's death, the prosecution had not proven exactly how Caylee died or that it was definitely murder rather than an accident. They said the circumstantial nature of the evidence, combined with questions raised by defense experts, left them with reasonable doubt. They had taken their responsibility seriously and voted according to the law as the judge had instructed. One juror stated that the decision to acquit was not easy and that several jurors were physically sick after rendering the verdict. Another said they cried for hours afterward. They understood the public would be angry, but they had to follow the evidence and the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. In their view, the prosecution had not met that burden regardless of what they personally believed about Casey's guilt. Casey was sentenced to 4 years in prison for the lying convictions, with credit for time served. She had been in jail since July 2008, nearly 3 years. With credit for good behavior, she would be released in just a few days. On July 17, 2011, Casey walked out of the Orange County Jail as a free woman. She was whisked away in an SUV, her destination unknown, as protesters gathered outside the jail to express their outrage. George and Cindy Anthony's response to the verdict was complex. Publicly, they said they were happy Casey had been acquitted, but remained devastated by the loss of Caylee. Their relationship with Casey was fractured, damaged by the accusations made during the trial and the years of lies and pain. George had been accused of horrific acts on national television, accusations he vehemently denied. The family would never be the same. Casey went into hiding immediately after her release. She faced death threats and intense public hatred. Private investigators hired by her defense team helped her relocate to an undisclosed location in Florida. She lived under an assumed name, trying to rebuild some kind of life outside the spotlight. Occasional photos surfaced, showing her at restaurants or other public places, each one generating fresh outrage online. In the years following the trial, Casey gave a few interviews. She maintained that Caylee's death was an accident and that she was not responsible. She claimed she still didn't know exactly what happened, but that she had been protecting her father by not telling the truth earlier. These statements were met with widespread skepticism, as they seemed like new variations of her pattern of lying. The case prompted widespread discussion about the American justice system. For some, the verdict proved the system worked correctly, that prosecutors must prove their case beyond reasonable doubt, and that juries take this responsibility seriously, even when it leads to unpopular results. For others, it showed the limitations of circumstantial evidence and the challenges of securing convictions in high-profile cases where defense attorneys can afford expert witnesses to challenge every piece of evidence. The media coverage of the case was also analyzed and criticized. Critics argued that the 24-hour news cycle's obsession with the case had turned it into entertainment rather than journalism. The constant speculation and discussion had created a circus atmosphere that may have made it harder to seat an impartial jury and conduct a fair trial. The case became a cautionary tale about media excess in criminal cases. Caylee's law was proposed in several states following the trial. These laws would make it a felony for a parent or guardian to fail to report a missing child within 24 hours or a child's death within 2 hours. Advocates argued such laws might have prevented Casey from waiting 31 days to report Caylee missing. Critics questioned whether criminal penalties were the right approach and whether such laws might discourage parents from eventually coming forward. The civil litigation following the criminal trial added another layer to the story. Zenaida Fernandez-Gonzalez, the woman whose name Casey had used for her fictional nanny, sued Casey for defamation. She claimed Casey's lies had destroyed her reputation and caused her emotional distress. A jury found in Gonzalez's favor, though collecting any judgment proved difficult as Casey had no assets or legitimate income. Roy Kronk, the utility worker who found Caylee's remains, also sued Casey for defamation after her defense team suggested he had moved or tampered with the body. His lawsuit highlighted how the trial had damaged multiple people beyond just the Anthony family. The legal battles continued for years, keeping Casey's name in the news, even as she tried to disappear from public view. George and Cindy attempted to move forward with their lives. They participated in a few interviews, speaking about their love for Caylee and the pain of losing her. Their marriage was strained by the events, and at one point George moved out temporarily. Eventually they reconciled and tried to find some peace. They established a foundation in Caylee's memory, though it too became controversial and eventually closed. The question of what really happened to Caylee Marie Anthony remained unanswered to the satisfaction of most people who followed the case. The not guilty verdict meant Casey would never face criminal punishment for her daughter's death, but it didn't provide closure or truth. The case remained a source of frustration and debate, a modern mystery that seemed to have an obvious answer that could never be legally proven. Casey's attempts to live a normal life were repeatedly complicated by her infamy. She tried to work various jobs, but was recognized and fired. She struggled to maintain relationships when people discovered who she was. Her face had been on television screens for years, and many Americans felt they knew her, or at least knew what they thought of her. That recognition made true anonymity impossible. Documentaries and books about the case continued to appear years after the trial. Each attempted to make sense of what happened, to find answers in the evidence and testimony. Some presented new theories about Caylee's death. Others focused on the media circus or the legal strategies employed by both sides. The case had become part of American cultural memory, referenced in discussions about justice, parenting, and truth. The forensic evidence that had seemed so damning during the investigation proved to be less definitive in court. The smell of death testimony was challenged by defense experts, who questioned the science behind it. The chloroform evidence was disputed. The hair with death banding was explained in alternative ways. This highlighted the gap between scientific certainty and legal proof, between what experts believe and what can be established beyond reasonable doubt. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was Casey's apparent lack of maternal instinct or concern. Whether Caylee died accidentally or was murdered, Casey's behavior afterwards seemed inexplicable to most people. A grieving mother, even one panicked about an accident, would presumably show some distress. Casey's partying and carefree demeanor during the 31 days suggested something fundamentally wrong in her psychological makeup. Psychological experts who analyzed Caylee from afar suggested various diagnoses. Some pointed to narcissistic personality disorder, characterized by lack of empathy and need for attention. Others suggested antisocial personality traits or pathological lying. Without Casey's cooperation in a formal evaluation, these remained speculation, but they offered possible explanations for behavior that otherwise seemed incomprehensible. The relationship between Caylee and her parents remained fractured. Though Cindy seemed to want reconciliation and maintain some contact with her daughter, George was reportedly less willing to forgive. The accusations made during the trial had cut too deep. Lee Anthony, Caylee's brother, also maintained distance from his sister. The family that had once lived together in a suburban Orlando home was permanently shattered. Public fascination with the case gradually faded, but never entirely disappeared. Each anniversary of Caylee's disappearance or the trial brought renewed media attention. Casey's occasional appearances in public, captured by photographers or bystanders, would generate online discussion. She remained one of the most hated women in America, unable to escape the court of public opinion even though she had been acquitted in a court of law. The case raised questions about modern parenting and the pressure on young mothers. Some observers noted that Caylee had become a mother young, possibly before she was emotionally ready. The expectations placed on her by her parents, particularly Cindy, may have created resentment. While this in no way excused her behavior, it provided context for understanding how dysfunction in the Anthony household may have contributed to tragedy. Social media had played a significant role in the case, both as evidence and as a platform for public opinion. Caylee's Facebook and MySpace posts were analyzed for clues about her state of mind. The public shared their theories and outrage online, creating a digital mob mentality. The case demonstrated how social media had changed both criminal investigations and public participation in high-profile trials. The prosecution's decision to seek the death penalty had been controversial from the start. Some believed it was appropriate given the age of the victim and the circumstances. Others felt it put too much pressure on the jury, possibly contributing to their reluctance to convict when the evidence was purely circumstantial. The death penalty debate in America was reflected in microcosm through this case and its outcome. Defense attorney Jose Baez became a celebrity of sorts after the trial. His aggressive strategy and willingness to make shocking accusations had proven effective, even if many people found his tactics distasteful. He wrote a book about the case, defending his approach and his client. Other defense attorneys studied his methods, particularly his use of opening statements to present an alternative narrative that put the prosecution on the defensive. The prosecutors, particularly Jeff Ashton, who later wrote his own book about the case, remained convinced of Caylee's guilt. They believed the evidence had been sufficient, and that the jury had simply failed to see what seemed obvious. The verdict was frustrating, but also a reminder that in the American system, the burden is on the state to prove guilt, not on the defendant to prove innocence. Caylee Marie Anthony was buried in a private ceremony, at a cemetery in Orlando. Her grave became a place of pilgrimage for some, with strangers leaving toys and flowers for a child they had never met, but whose story had touched them. The grave marker showed her dates of birth and death, forever 2 years old, her potential unrealized. The wooded area where Caylee's remains were found became an unofficial memorial site. People left stuffed animals, balloons, and crosses near the spot. Eventually, the property owner tired of the attention and cleared the items away. The location returned to being just another patch of woods, though those who knew its significance could never see it the same way. As years passed, Caylee attempted to build some kind of life. She remained in Florida, living quietly, and reportedly working occasional jobs that didn't require public interaction. She gave a couple of interviews to documentary filmmakers, still maintaining her innocence and claiming not to know exactly what happened to Caylee. These interviews were analyzed frame by frame by people looking for signs of deception or remorse. In a 2017 interview, Caylee claimed for the first time that she believed Caylee had drowned in the pool and that her father George had been responsible for disposing of the body. This was an evolution of the defense's trial theory, but it lacked any evidence to support it. George continued to deny any involvement and maintain that Caylee was lying, as she had always lied. The impact on the Orlando community lingered. The case had put their city in the national spotlight for tragic reasons. The courthouse became a landmark associated with the trial. Tour guides sometimes pointed it out to visitors. The community had been invested in finding Caylee, and many residents felt the verdict had denied them and Caylee justice. The disappointment and anger remained palpable years later. The legal system's handling of the case became a case study in law schools. Professors used the trial to teach students about circumstantial evidence, burden of proof, and jury decision-making. The forensic aspects were analyzed in scientific journals. The case had become educational material, stripped of its emotional content, and examined clinically for the lessons it could teach future lawyers and investigators. One lasting question was whether justice had been served. For those who believed Caylee was guilty of murder, the answer was clearly no. A child was dead and no one was being held criminally responsible. For those who believed in the legal system's requirement of proof beyond reasonable doubt, the verdict represented the system working as designed, even if the outcome was unsatisfying. These competing views of justice remained irreconcilable. The case highlighted weaknesses in how missing children cases are handled. The 31-day delay in reporting Caylee missing had allowed crucial evidence to degrade and made establishing a timeline nearly impossible. Law enforcement learned from this, improving protocols for Amber Alerts and missing child investigations. Caylee's case, tragic as it was, led to changes that might help other children in the future. Caylee Anthony struggled particularly hard with the aftermath. She had lost her granddaughter, and in many ways her daughter as well. Her testimony during the trial, where she appeared to lie to help Caylee, had damaged her credibility. She faced criticism from those who believed she should have done more to protect Caylee or been more honest about Caylee's failings as a mother. The weight of all these burdens showed in her face during rare public appearances. George Anthony attempted suicide in early 2009 before Caylee's remains had been found. He checked into a motel and wrote goodbye letters, indicating he could not handle the pain and stress any longer. Police found him before he could harm himself, and he received psychiatric treatment. The incident revealed the devastating toll the case had taken on the family, beyond just the loss of Caylee. The media figures who had covered the trial became permanently associated with it. Nancy Grace, who had provided nightly commentary on her HLN show, was criticized for her prosecutorial tone and seeming presumption of Caylee's guilt before the verdict. Other commentators similarly faced accusations of trying and convicting Caylee in the court of public opinion. The case raised ethical questions about how media should cover ongoing criminal cases. Caylee's ability to maintain so many lies for so long fascinated psychologists and deception experts. She had created an entire fake job, complete with detailed stories about coworkers and responsibilities. She had invented a nanny who existed in her stories with a full backstory. This level of fabrication suggested either mental illness or a personality so divorced from truth that lying was as natural as breathing. The Zenaida Fernandez-Gonzalez lawsuit revealed more about Caylee's pattern of appropriating real people's names for her lies. She had met the real Zenaida only in passing at an apartment complex years earlier, but had taken her name and built an entire fictional character around it. This casual theft of someone's identity to construct lies showed a disturbing disregard for how her actions affected others. The physical evidence that was found with Caylee's remains continued to be debated long after the trial. The duct tape in particular remained controversial. Prosecutors had argued its placement proved murder, but the defense suggested it had been placed after death, or even after the body was found. Without being able to determine exactly when the tape was applied, its evidentiary value became questionable to some jurors. The chloroform evidence had seemed damning when first revealed. Computer searches for how to make chloroform, combined with unusually high levels of chloroform detected in the car trunk, suggested premeditation. But the defense had challenged both the computer evidence and the reliability of the chloroform testing. They raised questions about contamination and proper scientific protocols. These challenges created enough doubt to weaken what had appeared to be strong evidence. The laundry bag found with Caylee's remains came from the Anthony home. This placed Casey at the scene of disposal, according to prosecutors. But the defense pointed out that other family members also had access to that laundry bag. George, in particular, could have used it if, as the defense claimed, he had found Caylee drowned and disposed of her body. This alternative explanation, however implausible to many people, was enough to create reasonable doubt for the jury. Casey's search history on her computer revealed disturbing patterns beyond just chloroform. She had looked up information about neck-breaking and household weapons in the months before Caylee's death. The prosecution argued this showed she had been planning violence. The defense suggested these searches were taken out of context, or might have been related to Casey's interest in crime shows, or could have been conducted by someone else in the house. The timeline of events remained murky despite extensive investigation. George claimed he last saw Caylee alive on June 16, 2008, when Casey left the house with her. Casey's cell phone records showed she was in the area of the Anthony home that day, but what happened to Caylee in the hours or days that followed could never be definitively established. This gap in the timeline made it difficult to prove exactly when and how Caylee died. Anthony Lazzaro's apartment became significant because Casey had spent so much time there during the period Caylee was missing. She essentially moved in with him, sleeping over nearly every night. The fact that she was able to act normally, maintaining a romantic relationship while her daughter was dead or missing, struck many people as proof of her guilt. But legally, strange behavior is not the same as proof of murder. The theory that Casey had kept Caylee's body in her car trunk for several days was supported by the decomposition odor and evidence. But the defense challenged whether that smell was definitely from human decomposition versus other sources. They brought in experts who testified that garbage, particularly when left in a hot car in Florida, could produce similar odors. This battle of experts left jurors having to decide whom to believe about something they could not smell themselves. Roy Cronk's role in discovering the remains became oddly controversial. He had called police about the location twice in August, before finally finding the remains in December. The defense suggested this pattern indicated he knew something or had moved the body. Prosecutors viewed these suggestions as desperate attempts to deflect blame. Kronk himself became an unwitting character in the drama, his good deed of reporting the remains turning into suspicion and litigation. The photographs of Casey partying during the 31 days became iconic images of the case. Pictures of her at nightclubs, smiling and dancing, were played repeatedly on news broadcasts. The Bella Vita tattoo she got during this period seemed to encapsulate her apparent lack of concern. These images made her unsympathetic to the public, but the defense argued that everyone grieves differently and that her behavior didn't prove she had committed murder. The jailhouse videos of Casey talking with her parents were revealing in unexpected ways. She seemed more concerned with trivial matters than with Caylee's whereabouts. She complained about not being able to watch television in jail. She asked about her boyfriend. When her mother tried to get information about Caylee, Casey became evasive and irritable. These conversations painted a picture of someone with unusual priorities and emotional responses. The friends who testified about Casey's behavior during the 31 days provided damaging testimony. They described her as happy, carefree, and normal, No one noticed any signs of distress or worry. She participated in conversations about plans for the future. She flirted with men. She seemed like a young woman enjoying her summer, not someone whose child was missing or dead. This collective testimony from multiple witnesses was hard to explain away. The Universal Studios incident, where Caylee took detectives to a workplace she didn't actually have, demonstrated her commitment to lies even when they were easily disproved. She had walked them through the building, led them down hallways before finally admitting she didn't work there. This willingness to lie so brazenly in the face of imminent discovery suggested a pathological relationship with truth that went beyond normal deception. Financial records showed Caylee had been stealing from her family for years before Caylee's death. She had forged checks from her grandmother's account. She had stolen money from her mother's purse and wallet. This pattern of theft showed a disregard for family bonds and a willingness to exploit those who trusted her. It also suggested someone with a sense of entitlement and lack of empathy for the harm she caused others. Caylee's ex-fiancé, Jesse Grunn, testified about her lying during their relationship years before Caylee was born. He described how she had lied about small things and large things alike, often unnecessarily. He said she seemed to lie even when the truth would have served her better. This testimony established that lying was a long-standing pattern for Caylee, not something that started with Caylee's disappearance. The pool drowning theory presented by the defense was challenged by the physical evidence. If Caylee had drowned accidentally, why was her body found with duct tape over her face? Why would George have hidden her remains in the woods rather than call 911? The theory required believing that George had engaged in an elaborate cover-up for an accident, which seemed implausible to many observers. The sexual abuse allegations against George were never substantiated by any evidence. Baez made these claims in opening statements, but no witnesses or evidence supported them during the trial. George denied the accusations forcefully. The strategy appeared designed to explain Caylee's lying and strange behavior as the result of trauma, but without proof, it remained merely an assertion that damaged George's reputation. The jury's relatively quick deliberations surprised many legal observers. In a case this complex with this much evidence, many expected the jury to take days or even weeks to reach a verdict. The fact that they returned in less than 11 hours suggested they had either found the defense's reasonable doubt arguments convincing or had fundamental problems with the prosecution's case that made their decision straightforward. Post-trial interviews with jurors revealed their thought process. Several said they believed Caylee was probably involved in Caylee's death, but that probably was not the same as beyond a reasonable doubt. They had taken the judge's instructions seriously about the state's burden of proof. They felt the prosecution had not definitively proved how Caylee died, when she died, or that Caylee was the one who killed her, if it was murder. The jury foreman later said that the evidence was largely circumstantial, and that each piece could be explained in different ways. He said they had voted on each charge separately and found that the prosecution had not met its burden on any of the serious charges. He acknowledged they were not saying Caylee was innocent, only that her guilt had not been proven beyond reasonable doubt according to the legal standard they were required to apply. Public reaction to the jurors' explanations was mixed. Some people accepted that the jurors had done their job according to the law. Others felt the jurors had somehow failed to see what seemed obvious to everyone else. The disconnect between public perception and jury verdict became a subject of discussion about whether high-profile cases could receive fair trials given media saturation and public prejudice. The Florida legislature examined whether changes to the law might address cases like this in the future. Caylee's law was proposed but faced opposition from some who worried about unintended consequences. The debate centered on whether creating new criminal penalties for failing to report a missing child or death would actually prevent future tragedies, or simply add punitive measures that might backfire. Caylee's post-trial life remained shrouded in secrecy. She gave occasional interviews but largely avoided public view. Paparazzi photos would surface periodically, showing her at a bar or restaurant, each one generating fresh outrage on social media. She reportedly struggled with employment and relationships. Her notoriety made normal life nearly impossible, though many felt she deserved whatever hardship resulted from her actions. The case's impact on forensic science was significant. The novel techniques used to analyze the car odor, while not ultimately persuasive to the jury, represented cutting-edge forensic investigation. The challenges raised by the defense led to discussions about standardizing methodologies and ensuring that forensic evidence met rigorous scientific standards before being admitted in court. The prosecution's reliance on circumstantial evidence was both necessary, given the lack of direct evidence, and ultimately insufficient to convince the jury. This highlighted an ongoing challenge in criminal justice: how to prove cases where there are no witnesses, no confession, and no smoking gun. The standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt is designed to protect the innocent, but it also means some guilty people may go free when evidence falls short. The case exposed fault lines in American society about class, motherhood, and justice. Caylee was a young woman from a working-class background who had a child young and struggled with parenting. Some saw her as a monster. Others saw her as a product of dysfunction and societal failure. These competing narratives played out in media coverage and public discussion, revealing deep disagreements about responsibility and accountability. The role of social media in both the investigation and public reaction was unprecedented at the time. Facebook posts were entered as evidence. Twitter erupted with opinions during the trial. Blog posts analyzed every detail. The case demonstrated how social media had changed both how crimes were investigated and how the public engaged with criminal trials. This digital dimension added layers of complexity to an already complicated case. Victim advocates pointed to Caylee as a reminder of why justice for children matters. A 2-year-old had died under suspicious circumstances, and no one was being held criminally responsible. The system had failed her, they argued, regardless of the legal technicalities that led to the verdict. The focus should be on preventing such tragedies rather than debating legal standards after the fact. The Anthony family's disintegration was complete and public. George and Cindy's marriage barely survived. Their relationships with both their adult children were damaged beyond repair. Lee Anthony gave emotional testimony at trial, but later distanced himself from the family drama. The home that had once been photographed as a crime scene stood as a monument to everything that had gone wrong. Casey's inability to maintain consistent stories, even to her own lawyers, became apparent as the trial progressed. The defense strategy seemed to shift over time, suggesting Caylee had told different versions of events to different people at different times. This made defending her challenging, because her own statements were so unreliable. Baez had to work with a client whose relationship with truth was fundamentally broken. The medical examiner's inability to determine an exact cause of death was a crucial weakness in the prosecution's case. Without being able to state definitively that Caylee had been smothered, strangled, or poisoned, the prosecution had to rely on inference from the duct tape and other evidence. The defense exploited this ambiguity, arguing that the manner of death could have been accidental rather than homicide. The Florida Sunshine Laws meant that most evidence and documents in the case were publicly available. This led to amateur sleuths analyzing every detail, creating their own theories, and sometimes interfering with the investigation. The case became a puzzle that thousands of people tried to solve from their computers, sharing ideas online and building communities around their theories about what really happened to Caylee. The emotional impact on those who followed the case was notable. People who had no connection to the Anthony family felt personally invested in the outcome. They watched the trial like a drama, with Caylee as the protagonist whose story had been cut tragically short. When the verdict came back not guilty, many felt genuine grief and anger, as if they had lost something themselves. The jury's relatively quick deliberations surprised many legal observers. In a case this complex with this much evidence, many expected the jury to take days or even weeks to reach a verdict. The fact that they returned in less than 11 hours suggested they had either found the defense's reasonable doubt arguments convincing or had fundamental problems with the prosecution's case that made their decision straightforward. Post-trial interviews with jurors revealed their thought process. Several said they believed Caylee was probably involved in Caylee's death, but that probably was not the same as beyond a reasonable doubt. They had taken the judge's instructions seriously about the state's burden of proof. They felt the prosecution had not definitively proved how Caylee died, when she died, or that Caylee was the one who killed her if it was murder. The jury foreman later said that the evidence was largely circumstantial, and that each piece could be explained in different ways. He said they had voted on each charge separately and found that the prosecution had not met its burden on any of the serious charges. He acknowledged they were not saying Caylee was innocent, only that her guilt had not been proven beyond reasonable doubt according to the legal standard they were required to apply. Public reaction to the jurors' explanations was mixed. Some people accepted that the jurors had done their job according to the law. Others felt the jurors had somehow failed to see what seemed obvious to everyone else. The disconnect between public perception and jury verdict became a subject of discussion about whether high-profile cases could receive fair trials given media saturation and public prejudice. The Florida legislature examined whether changes to the law might address cases like this in the future. Caylee's law was proposed but faced opposition from some who worried about unintended consequences. The debate centered on whether creating new criminal penalties for failing to report a missing child or death would actually prevent future tragedies, or simply add punitive measures that might backfire. Caylee's post-trial life remained shrouded in secrecy. She gave occasional interviews but largely avoided public view. Paparazzi photos would surface periodically, showing her at a bar or restaurant, each one generating fresh outrage on social media. She reportedly struggled with employment and relationships. Her notoriety made normal life nearly impossible, though many felt she deserved whatever hardship resulted from her actions. The case's impact on forensic science was significant. The novel techniques used to analyze the car odor, while not ultimately persuasive to the jury, represented cutting-edge forensic investigation. The challenges raised by the defense led to discussions about standardizing methodologies and ensuring that forensic evidence met rigorous scientific standards before being admitted in court. The prosecution's reliance on circumstantial evidence was both necessary, given the lack of direct evidence, and ultimately insufficient to convince the jury. This highlighted an ongoing challenge in criminal justice: how to prove cases where there are no witnesses, no confession, and no smoking gun. The standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt is designed to protect the innocent, but it also means some guilty people may go free when evidence falls short. The physical location where Caylee's remains were found, so close to the Anthony home, suggested local knowledge. Whoever placed her body there knew the area well, knew that the wooded spot was secluded but not so remote that the remains might never be found. This geographic detail pointed to someone from the immediate family or neighborhood, narrowing the suspect pool considerably, even if it didn't definitively identify the responsible party. The evolution of Caylee's stories over time showed a pattern of adapting lies to fit new circumstances. When confronted with evidence that contradicted one lie, she would construct a new lie that incorporated the new information. This flexibility in her deception suggested practice and skill at manipulation. It also made investigating her statements exhausting for law enforcement, as they had to check and recheck every claim. George and Cindy's changing testimonies raised questions about their own involvement, not necessarily in Caylee's death, but in protecting Caylee or obscuring facts. Cindy's claim about searching for chlorophyll instead of chloroform seemed transparently false to many observers. George's testimony about seeing Caylee and Caylee leave on June 16th became a key point of contention, as the defense suggested he was lying to cover up the drowning he had allegedly discovered. The case demonstrated how circumstantial evidence, no matter how abundant, may not overcome reasonable doubt when each piece can be individually explained in ways that don't prove guilt. The prosecution had assembled dozens of pieces of evidence, but the defense only needed to create doubt about each one separately, rather than explaining them all cohesively. This is a fundamental challenge in circumstantial cases. Caylee's short life was overshadowed by the circumstances of her death and the trial that followed. She was remembered primarily as a victim, rather than as a child who had lived. Photos of her smiling, singing, and playing were shown repeatedly, but always in the context of loss and mystery. The tragedy of Caylee's case was not just that she died young, but that her entire existence became defined by that death. The verdict's impact on the prosecutors was significant. Jeff Ashton retired from the state attorney's office not long after the trial. The loss in such a high-profile case, one where he believed the evidence was strong, took a toll. Other prosecutors learned from the case, studying what had worked and what had failed, trying to understand how to better present circumstantial evidence to juries in future cases. The defense team's success in this case elevated their profiles, but also made them controversial figures. Jose Baez went on to defend other high-profile clients, his reputation built partly on his victory in the Anthony case. But he also faced ongoing criticism for his tactics, particularly the unsubstantiated allegations against George. The case became his defining moment, for better or worse. Public fascination with the case reflected broader cultural interests in true crime and criminal justice. The trial was watched like entertainment, with viewers developing favorites among the attorneys and witnesses. This entertainment aspect troubled some observers, who felt it trivialized the death of a child and turned tragedy into spectacle. The line between legitimate public interest and voyeuristic consumption was blurred throughout. The Caylee Anthony case remains one of the most controversial verdicts in recent American legal history. It challenged assumptions about how justice works and exposed limitations in the criminal justice system's ability to address certain types of cases. The gap between what people believed happened and what could be proven in court illustrated fundamental tensions in how we think about guilt, innocence, and proof. Years after the trial, Caylee remains a polarizing figure. To some, she is a woman who got away with murder, who used lies and manipulation to escape justice for killing her daughter. To others, she is someone who suffered an unimaginable tragedy and was then persecuted by a justice system more interested in conviction than truth. Most people fall somewhere between these extremes, unsure what to believe, but troubled by the questions the case raised. Caylee Marie Anthony would have been a teenager now had she lived. She would be attending school, making friends, discovering her interests and talents. Instead, she is forever frozen as a toddler in photographs, her potential never realized. Her grave in Orlando receives occasional visitors who leave toys and flowers, strangers who feel compelled to mark her brief life with some gesture of remembrance. The lessons from the case continue to influence how crimes against children are investigated and prosecuted. Law enforcement agencies have improved their protocols for missing children cases. Forensic scientists have refined their methodologies to meet more rigorous standards. Prosecutors have learned about the challenges of relying solely on circumstantial evidence. These improvements represent Caylee's unintended legacy. George and Cindy Anthony live quietly now, largely out of the public eye. They have given occasional interviews over the years, always returning to their love for Caylee and the pain of losing her. Their relationship with Caylee remains complicated and mostly non-existent. The family that once gathered around the dinner table together has been permanently fragmented by tragedy and its aftermath. Caylee's future remains uncertain. She is still relatively young, with decades of life ahead of her. Whether she can ever truly move past her infamy and build something resembling a normal life remains to be seen. The internet never forgets, and her face and story are permanently etched into digital memory. Every attempt at normalcy will be shadowed by her past and the questions that surround her. The question of what really happened to Caylee Marie Anthony on June 16, 2008, will likely never be definitively answered. The person who knows the truth has told so many lies that separating fact from fiction may be impossible. The physical evidence degraded during the months before discovery. The opportunity to find clear answers was lost in those 31 days of silence and deception. The case stands as a reminder that justice and truth are not always the same thing. The legal system requires proof beyond reasonable doubt, a high standard designed to protect the innocent, but one that sometimes means the guilty go free. Whether Caylee was truly innocent or simply benefited from insufficient evidence will be debated for years to come. What remains undisputed is that a 2-year-old child died under suspicious circumstances, and no one has been held criminally accountable. For those who believe in the system, this represents it working as designed. For those who believe in Caylee, it represents a profound failure that can never be made right.